In fact, one of the things at the university we require now is that every student take an ethics class. So these ways of thinking, or the importance of thinking about ethical issues, is something which I believe in. And I think is important to education.
Does anyone ever plagiarize in an ethics class?
Oh, sure.
Wouldn't that be irony? This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine. Several weeks ago, I sat down at the Bangor office of the Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife with Special Projects biologist Nate Webb. We talked about the big game management plan that IFW was just beginning. That means management of deer, bear, moose, and turkey. That show got a reaction. Mark Anderson is a retired professor of economics at the University of Maine, and he writes a blog for the Bangor Daily News called Stirring the Pot. Professor Anderson had 3 questions about the ethics of wildlife management and took exception to some of the things he heard on this show. Well then, I went over to Mark's house and let him stir the pot some more. We're going to get into it, and you're about to hear the result. Ethics and wildlife. This could get juicy. Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine is brought to you by Hammond Lumber, Doors Equipment, Napa Auto Parts, EBS, and Supercuts in Bangor, Brewer, and Old Town. Everybody's got opinions. What I found intriguing about Mark Anderson's blog is that here was a guy who is a noted economist, 35 years at the University of Maine on the faculty, a guy who has a history of involvement in the question of ethics. Here was a guy who followed the whole bear debate carefully, but was neither a hunter nor an animal rights activist. He was basically much like the average Maine citizen, but with the analytical skills of an economics professor. Mark raised 3 basic questions. First, do the ends justify the means when it comes to game management? That is, if you set harvest targets in order to control bear populations, is it okay if those ends are achieved by methods that some might consider unethical? Second, since funding for game management comes almost entirely from sportsmen, does that skew the department's management objectives in favor of the sporting community? And third, we're now intervening so much in nature to manage wildlife. Is it really still all that wild? Well, these questions actually come up quite often, so let's dig in. Mark, welcome to Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine.
Thank you, Bob. It's great to be with you.
Great to have you on the show because you have been following the show for a while, so you know what it is I do, and you...
Absolutely. If we're here, we're watching Wild Maine. And if we don't see it, we don't hear it Saturday morning, we listen Sunday morning.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Well, you're a retired professor of economics at the University of Maine.
Correct, yeah.
There for 35 years?
35 years,
wow.
yeah.
Let's establish that you are a Mainer, born in Caribou, went to high school where?
Brewer, Roger Brewer High School.
Went to college at Bowdoin.
At Bowdoin, which I mean, that's the southern part of the state. Some people don't think that's Maine.
Well, I went to Colby, but I do forgive you.
Okay, fair enough.
But I don't want anyone to think, oh, this guy's from away. He's got this elitist attitude from the city. You're as Maine as anybody I've ever met.
Yeah, and on my mother's side, I can brag, we go back to colonial Maine. My father came from Connecticut, so...
So you're not really a stakeholder. You're just an interested observer in watching this from the side.
That's right. And I think I'd call myself a citizen on this issue.
Yeah. Which is perfect, because that's what I wanted to talk to you. It's... You know, there are so many people who are stakeholders in this who have an opinion and can't wait to share it. But to have somebody with a certain learned knowledge about economics, which you are an economist, and also just a university professor's concept of ethics and how that's not only understood but taught.
Yeah, and I think from what interests me about this is for 25 of those years that I was at the university, I was involved with our undergraduate program, which we used to call Natural Resources, and now it's called Ecology and Environmental Sciences. Mm-hmm. So I've spent a lot of time with students around issues of science and technology, but then inevitably it gets into questions of ethics. In fact, one of the things at the university we require now is that every student take an ethics class, and we had a number of different ethics courses that in that program in Ecology and Environmental Sciences we asked our students to take. So these ways of thinking, or the importance of thinking about ethical issues, is something which I believe in, and I think is important to education.
Does anyone ever plagiarize in an ethics class?
Oh, sure.
Wouldn't that be irony? Well, you know, I live in a political world where opinions trump facts, or people cherry pick their facts to fit their opinions.
Sure.
So it's really hard to get into a deeper discussion. So I thought we'd do that today.
Great.
We get a lot further if I think everyone out there just took a moment to say to themselves, I might be wrong about that.
Yeah, or just say, why am I feeling differently about this issue than that person over there?
Yeah.
I don't even have to admit that I'm wrong if I just try to understand why they don't see the world the way I see the world.
Agreed. That is so huge in my opinion.
Yeah.
I don't mind arguing with somebody, but I should at least make the attempt to understand why they're arguing the other side of it.
Sure, exactly.
That way you can find the middle ground or a joint solution that you both can agree with much faster.
Or at least walk away and understand that, that you had the conversation and you're going to agree to disagree, and that's the best we can do.
Yeah, and often that's because you've had a different background or a different experience, and it's not a bad thing to come away with that kind of disagreement when you start from a basic factual premise difference to begin with.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, you do a weekly blog in the Bangor Daily News website.
I do, yeah.
It's called Stirring the Pot.
Correct.
So I figured we'd stir the pot today. Now, you wrote some opinions about a show that I did about 3 weeks ago. I had a biologist from Inland Fisheries and Wildlife on the air, and we were talking about their big game management plan. And your blog essentially says, well, you've got 3 concerns about that. And I thought they were worth discussing. So your first one is your blog suggests that I&W's concept of wildlife management is that the ends justify the means.
Yeah, these were reactions.
Yeah.
It was a great interview, and it was about the big game management planning process that they're going through now. And inevitably, all these conversations about big game have to get into bear hunting.
Yeah.
Right, that's right. And I was here, obviously, for both of the referendum votes. 2004 was the first one, I think, and 2014 is the second. And when the conversation that you had got to the question of bear hunting, what I heard, and I hope I heard it correctly, what I heard was all 3 methods of hunting are necessary to achieve the management goals, and that otherwise we would have too many nuisance bears in the state that we had to worry about. And I understand that argument, but I wondered whether what we were saying is that we would acknowledge the ethical or value-based foundation for any hunting method that was necessary to achieve those means.
Grenades.
Whatever it might be.
Right.
And as I pointed out in the blog, I think I probably voted yes in 2004. I know I voted yes in 2014, but my concern was over the trapping issue more so than the others. And I think had we, after 2004, agreed that at least trapping was not particularly sporting, and I think the number of bear that are taken by trapping is pretty small.
It is very small
compared to the other 2. Isn't there a way we could say at least we recognize that maybe that's a troubling way of dealing with this other species? And for me it's a question of, when we saw this summer bear run across the field here, which is really unusual out here, and you looked at that, and it's not human. Clearly it's different from us, but there's something pretty exciting about that. And this idea of seeing that creature in a leg hole trap, and I've heard people say they don't struggle. I really find that a little hard to believe, although I must confess I've never seen a bear captured in a leg hole trap. Just waiting for someone to come along and shoot it, that doesn't feel like sport. Right. And I think if we had said we're going to do away with that and use the other 2, I can understand the element of sport in the other 2 hunting methods. Not many people are hunting bear for food. There are some, but I think that's a pretty small part of the population.
My understanding is that actually a lot of people like bear and they are hunting it for food.
Okay.
When you talk to the hunters, just not only is it used for food by most of the hunters, but there's even a Hunters for the Hungry program where if you don't want it, you can still feed soup kitchens. So, I don't think many of those bears are going to waste.
Right. But again, this gets back to maybe the fundamental theme that runs through that whole piece, which is science doesn't solve all problems, or even address all problems, and for someone who taught in a science-based program, that sounds like a little bit of heresy. But here's one where just the need to achieve a certain number shouldn't justify us doing whatever we want in the woods.
My guest is Dr. Mark Anderson, Professor Emeritus of Economics at the University of Maine. He blogs for the Bangor Daily News, and he raised some questions about a radio show I did a few weeks ago about big game management with the Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife. The truth is, I raised some questions about the questions he raises. And I'll get to the first big one right after we take a break. This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9, The Ticket. This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9, The Ticket. Dr. Mark Anderson is a retired economics professor at the University of Maine. As a native Mainer, born in Caribou, high schooled in Brewer, colleged in Brunswick, he is not from away. Nowadays, Mark writes a blog on the Bangor Daily News website called Stirring the Pot, and Mark thinks that when the Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife manages game, more consideration should be given to ethics, not just science. Well, interesting. Well, I'm going to contend right off the bat, I guess, that it's not IF&W's job to do ethics. They don't do ethics. What they do is they do what they're told, essentially, in this democracy where the people decide what the ethics are through their legislative branch.
Sure. Yeah.
They establish what the ethics are. And then the department has to follow that. And so far, the people of Maine have said, nope, that's an acceptable method according to our ethical standards in the state. At that point, the department says, the last time the people decided how many bears they thought they could handle as a carrying capacity without causing problems was 23,000. We're up over 30. If we lose any of our methods, things are going to get only worse, according to the standards the people set.
Yeah.
So the IF&W folks are following that standard, I guess, rather than any kind of ethical judgment.
I think you're right.
Well, good. Then we can stop right there.
That's right. They are. However, I think when the members of the department weighed in on the referendum publicly, they did assert that this was, in their minds, a problem of science. That this is something which science could address, and we're the best scientists. Well, absolutely true. We're the best scientists around on this issue, and since this is fundamentally a problem of science, trust us, and we're going to go ahead. And it's. I think it's partly a problem of science, but it is an ethical issue. Yeah.
Well, it is. I mean, I think we, the people, have to have the ethical argument.
Oh, absolutely.
And I've actually had this conversation about a year ago with Matt Dunlap on this radio show. I don't know if you caught that one, but we were talking about there's really a number of different ethics questions going on. There's personal ethics, the code of conduct each one of us would follow. There's cultural ethics, which is what is the norm that society expects. They would expect your own personal ethics to at least conform to certain norms. And then there's ethics that we actually go so far as to legislate.
Sure, and the question of cultural ethics is a realm where the conversations are important. By having these conversations, we start to challenge each other about what it is we think collectively we should do and shouldn't do.
What keeps me up nights is how our ethical view about wildlife management is completely colored by how charismatic the animal is.
Sure.
You were saying something earlier, and it put in mind that if I see an orca, killer whale, dead on the dock, just recently harvested, I'd be kind of sad. But if I see a great white shark, just as big and mean, sitting there, I'd be celebrating.
Exactly.
They're two living, sentient beings about the same size, occupying much the same niche.
Yeah.
For some reason, I like one better than the other, and that colors my ethical judgment about how to hunt them.
Exactly. And my favorite example of that, and I used this in a class I taught for a number of years on environmental economics, was the can of tuna that we have in the grocery store with a dolphin safe logo on it. So why is it we save dolphins and eat tuna? Why don't we have dolphin in cans with tuna safe logos on it? We have this cultural predisposition that says this animal is desirable and needs to be protected, and the level of protections that we have for dolphin in tuna fishery are very stringent. But we have no compunction about eating tuna, which in the water appear to me to be similarly, beautiful creatures.
I mean, so much of that is cultural, based on on our perception of that critter. I mean, we don't eat horses, we don't eat dogs, we don't eat cats, but other cultures do.
We do, yeah. We used to, when I was younger, horse meat was available. That was not unheard of, but we don't do it now.
So the bear, as you described it earlier, is a really charismatic critter. Wandering through Holden in a backfield, you watch it go, and it looks just wonderful. And therefore, we have a higher level of concern, I think, about what it is we do with that if we're going to hunt it.
Yeah, and I think there's another issue there, which I think is in the back of people's minds, but we haven't had this conversation either. If we say that trapping bear is the one of these 3 hunting techniques that we perhaps want to let go, right? So we're gonna ban that one and keep hunting with dogs and keep the baiting system in place. That then says, well, geez, if it's a problem trapping bear, what about trapping in general? So it starts to open up that conversation.
And it should.
Well, right.
Because once again, we come back to the bear is more charismatic than a weasel.
Sure, it is, yeah. And in fact, I find some people, it's amazing how some people react to beaver. Some people just love watching beaver, and other people think beaver is a pest in the woods, right, for the damage that they do to timber stands.
Yep.
And, exactly.
Well, I'm a live and let live kind of guy, but if a mouse gets into my pantry, I'm going to trap him.
Exactly.
In fact, I'm going to be a serial killer and take out his whole family.
Sure, yeah.
Because he's not as charismatic as that bear.
Yeah.
But it's trapping. I mean, it's ethically, you're talking about a living, sentient being.
Yeah.
And we do treat it differently because of how we feel about it.
Yeah.
That's a weird kind of ethics conversation when it really has more to do with how we feel about the critter than the activity that we're engaged in.
Yeah, and I think there's also some people have talked about some wildlife are ones that humans have a better sense of. It's not just that they're charismatic, but we somehow almost relate to them. They're more like us. We can see, and I think that's it with dolphin in particular. The dolphin we perceive as more intelligent, more social. They communicate like us, and therefore, being more like us, they're given this sort of higher ethical status. Yeah.
Well, I think that probably does have something to do with it. And again, that's our own perceptions. It's not. When you boil it right down, it's like a living creature just like the other one we don't like so much.
Exactly.
It's weird.
Yeah.
Well, ethics evolve too, and I guess one of the biggest things that ever shocked me, you hear about this was our sporting tradition, and therefore we should leave it alone. But the fact is ethics do evolve, and about 10 years ago, England banned fox hunting. No more tally-ho. They've been doing that since the 1500s.
Yeah.
Talk about a long-standing tradition.
And so now they have to go to Virginia to fox hunt. That's right. Yeah.
Another big evolvement of ethics that came to mind was cockfighting.
Oh,
that goes back. I looked it up. It goes back 6,000 years.
Yeah.
Long before the pyramids were built, just that far back. And they finally banned it in Louisiana 8 years ago.
Okay, that's right. And that was the last state.
That was the last state. It's still legal in other countries, obviously.
And like you said earlier, then that's in that second category of those sort of cultural ethics, right? So it's the community norm, and those norms change over time. Yeah.
So we may get to the point where our sense of this ethical issue evolves such that we all more or less agree, okay, bear hunting with traps is wrong.
Yeah.
I mean, we may get there, but we haven't got there yet after 2 votes.
Yeah, no, we haven't gotten there. And an analogy maybe is over foods, right? The way people think about particularly meat production. So now you can get chicken that's labeled, that's been treated differently than chicken that's unlabeled, which reflects this sense that our values are changing, that we have some sort of commitment that's beyond ourselves, and that we should pay for it.
Cruelty in raising our food is not good.
Right. Yeah,
it's a good ethical place for us, I think, to arrive at.
Yeah.
I'm sitting here in the home of Mark Anderson, retired professor of economics at the University of Maine. We're talking about the ethics of hunting, which is always a strange discussion because ethics are essentially personal and reflect a lot of different things for different people based on their own personal values and experiences. And in the case of hunting, much depends on how sexy we think the animal is. When we return, I'll suggest some things we do to other animals that nobody even bats an eye about. This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine. Saturday mornings at 9, Sunday mornings at 8 on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. Today's show is coming to you from the home of Mark Anderson, a professor of economics and a blogger for the Bangor Daily News. In his blog, Mark raised some questions about a radio show we aired a few weeks ago, discussing big game management at the Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife. So, we're having the ethics debate. Defining what's ethical is an interesting one, like beagles chasing rabbits, using any critter to go catch another critter. Ethical or not?
Yeah. And the interesting part of that is, since the dog was once a wild animal that's now domesticated, and this sort of behavior, sort of coexisting behavior between dogs and humans, we generally think hunting with dogs, at least for some kinds of things, is part of this cultural tradition, and it's because we've sort of either the dogs have domesticated us or we've domesticated them, right?
I'm pretty sure the dogs control us. They got an easy life.
Yeah,
Most of
them. Yeah.
Well, here's another one. Sticking a hook in the back of a bait fish in order to catch a bigger fish.
Yeah.
That we don't even debate that. We don't have any kind of
that.
ethical discussion
Right.
at all until you boil it down and said, we did what? You stick a hook in a fish and then go catch another fish?
Right.
You know, get that fish to eat this one that you've just hooked. That's that's kind of a shocking way to think about it when you put it that way, but there's no even hint of that kind of ethical discussion, nor will there likely be.
Probably not. That one's going to come later on.
Yeah, right.
That's right.
Could be.
Yeah.
But it does seem like we really split hairs a lot, once again, depending on what the goal is and how charismatic we think the critter is that we're trying to protect.
And where we came from, individually.
Yeah. I mean, in some states, it's legal to bait deer.
Okay.
We would not do that here, but in some states, they have so many deer.
Yeah.
Now, you objected to trapping bears because it isn't sporting to trap a bear in a leg hole trap, have it wait up to 24 hours, and have the hunter walk up and shoot it. I think that's pretty much what you put in your blog.
That's what I said, yeah.
So what's the unsporting part? Is it the trapping, the waiting, or the shooting?
Well, it's certainly the skill that the hunter has to bring to that is less than into the other means of hunting.
Boy, would you get an argument from the trappers out of that?
Out of that?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
At least, well, I'll relate what I've gotten from trappers is you can only use one trap. Obviously, you have to check it every 24 hours. So if you've put all of your effort into that one trap, you better know exactly where to put it, how to place it. You've still got to take care of all of your scent and the clues that you were there. And you've basically got to trick this one bear out there in the woods in your one trap and get him to step in, and it almost never happens. It may be the hardest way to do it, and so nobody ever really does anymore. So I would argue it's just the opposite. It's the hardest way to get it.
It's the hardest way to get
it.
So, but in my naive perspective, it doesn't sound like hunting.
Yeah. Well, and they would push back and say, no, it's not hunting, it's trapping. It's an entirely different sport.
Okay. Yeah.
And they would consider it still to be a sport that takes a tremendous amount of woodcraft to be able to pull off successfully.
It's a skill.
Yeah, it's very much a skill.
Right. Yeah.
The result's the same. You put the bear in the freezer.
That's right.
And obviously you do have to shoot it because the bear's not going to go there voluntarily.
And maybe the most troubling part is, as you draw this out for me, is the fact that it's there in the trap, and that's, we don't know what bear think like, but that's got to be scary. Certainly
perplexing.
Yeah.
You know, when I talk to some of the biologists about it, because they do the radio collaring, so this is the same method they use to capture their bears. The story, I guess, is, first of all, they're not leg hole traps, they're foothold traps, and they just snare and hold. And I guess it's rather confusing to the animal, wondering, hey, why can't I move?
Yeah.
And I'm told by the biologists, often you show up and the bear's sleeping or snoozing or lying down.
Yeah.
It's,
there was a great article 40 years ago that relates to this by a philosopher called What Is It Like to Be a Bat? And it was really about human consciousness, and it wasn't about ethics. But this question about how do we think about this when we put ourselves into the other situation, and maybe that's similar to this charismatic piece. Is my perception is that getting caught in the trap, I'm not going to be pleased about that, and maybe I'm projecting human feelings onto a bear. But if I were a bear and I were being hunted, that's the one way that I would find most objectionable. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, and I think I do the same thing. I would project and say, a sniper taking me out while I'm eating a donut. I think I'd prefer that over waiting for my sorry fate to come.
Yes, and given what I've heard about bear senses, I have to know that the hunter's coming.
Yeah, they do. Their senses are unbelievable.
Yeah.
But when you parse it out, which part is the unethical part, or is it the combination of all three?
That's a great question.
Well, I mean,
I think it's now that you've made me think about that question. I think it's the holding part.
The whole, okay.
Yeah.
So it's not really the weight, because 24 hours. I mean, is there any way you could shorten that so that it would be ethical? And the answer is probably not.
Right.
24 hours is a standard we pick right now, because you ought to check your traps once a day.
Once a day, anyway.
So it's that's how long the bear's going to have to wait for his sorry fate. The shooting part, I mean, that's the end result for all of them. So
exactly.
It's really the restraint that this. I don't. If I were to do an opinion poll among bears, I would think being chased by dogs before meeting your fate would be worse, but I don't know. I'd have to ask it next bear I see.
Yeah, those are great ways to pose the question.
All right. In that case, since I'm on a roll, I'll give you another one. If you set your ethical criteria as which method gives the bear the best chance to get away, trapping wins hand down. That's, in fact, maybe the most sporting way to go after a bear, because the bear has the best chance of escaping the freezer.
Because it has the lowest success rate.
Success rate's abysmally low.
But how do you calculate success rate there? In terms of the percentage of traps that yield a bear?
Yeah. I don't know how many traps are actually successful on an annual basis.
Do we know how many traps are out there?
No. All I know is the harvest rate, which is really low as a percentage, but I don't know how many guys are trapping.
But if there's only 100 traps out there,
and everyone gets a bear,
right? So,
so you would argue that would be unsporting, because it's a foolproof method of capturing a bear if that were the case.
Or again, projecting myself into the experience of the bear, right? Yeah.
But on the other hand, if it turns out that traps are woefully unsuccessful most of the time, and the bear has the best chance of avoiding ending up in the freezer, that would maybe be the most sporting way to.
From the perspective of the
bear,
not the individual bear who got trapped, only of all the bears. Right, so if all the bears had to vote, right?
That's right.
This is the least risk. Then I'm gonna be able to, but for the one bear that got caught, then it's the worst technique.
Yeah, all the other bears are saying, "Oh, they got Bob."
That's right. Yeah.
Oh well, care for some donuts. Mark Anderson is my guest. We're debating hunting ethics. He's an economics professor. I'm just Bob Duchesne, and this is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine. Up next, since the Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife gets its money from hunting and fishing licenses, does that lead the department to make management decisions that are overly skewed toward sportsmen? Ooh. Stand by. This is Sports Radio 92.9, The Ticket. This is Sports Radio 92.9, The Ticket, with Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine. My guest is economics professor Mark Anderson. He writes a blog for the Bangor Daily News called Stirring the Pot. And the pot he is stirring now is a complaint that's made a lot, that the Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife goes too far out of its way to please sportsmen with its big game management practices, because sportsmen are the ones paying the bills through their hunting and fishing licenses. So let's stir the pot. So your view, because IF&W gets its revenue from the hunters, proper management of game species trumps management of non-game species. So we get into the things like deer versus coyote argument.
Yeah, I'm not sure I said proper. Did I say proper?
I don't remember.
You're right.
I even brought your article with me. But
so this is the most relevant economics part of that blog, because we have in the economics of government regulation and government service programs something we call rent seeking. And rent seeking is when particular groups are effective in accomplishing a change in the law or a change in regulations, or maintaining a given law or regulations on the basis of their narrow self-interest, recognizing that we all have narrow self-interest out here. But some people are just better than that than others. And we have a phenomenon that we call, a version in economics, we call it government failure, which we call the capture thesis. And the capture thesis is the idea that some interest groups, types of companies, non-governmental organizations, however you want to think about it, have been particularly good at capturing a regulatory body and getting the regulatory body to do its bidding. So, for example, some people have suggested that cell phone companies have been really good at capturing the Federal Communications Commission and have, as a and Congress, and as a result, gotten a larger part of the bandwidth available for communications compared to, say, broadcast television. Or, the whole switch from analog to digital TV was to free up spectrum for cell phone companies. So what in economics we do when we get people who suggest that there's one of these circumstances, the first thing we do is try to follow the money. And when we have dedicated revenue-funded agencies, there's much more likelihood of rent-seeking and regulatory capture because the agency personnel are smart. They realize that they have a particular interest in satisfying whatever body generates the revenues that support them. So, and a great example of this, to my mind, is that I mentioned in the blog, were deer and coyotes. We can hunt coyotes 6 days a week, 52 weeks a year. We can hunt them at night for what, 40 of those 52?
Significant, most of the year.
And historically, we've talked about coyotes as threat to livestock. Well, that's not a big issue in Maine. To some extent,
really
but it's not a huge issue. But really, it's, as I talk to people, it's a sense that coyotes adversely affect the size of the deer herd, and so we essentially take a creature that is of interest to hunters primarily because it helps increase deer numbers, and say we can take as many of those as you want. I think that if the agency were funded out of the general fund, and fees just went into the general fund, and there wasn't that linkage there, the conversation around what we did with various species would be different. And coyotes are a good example. And as I mentioned in the column, I just, we snowshoe out the back of the house here, and we'll, once every 2 or 3 winters, we'll see a coyote running across the ridge. That's pretty exciting to watch. And sometimes there'll be a pack that'll howl at night, and I'm not sure, it's almost as exciting as a barred owl, which we have a lot of about back here. But that doesn't enter into management plans because that doesn't speak to the revenue flows for the agency.
One of the things that IFNW, I think, would justifiably push back on is that all these management goals are set by a public process. They update their plans regularly with as much public input as they get. The other crowd, the opponents of that theory, say, well, no, it's only the hunters are showing up in that discussion in the first place. We're never asked. We're never. It doesn't matter what we say anyway. It's going to follow what the hunters want. But IFNW would say, no, this is a public process, and as far as I can tell from who I've seen participating in some of these, it's a pretty broad reach of public.
It is, absolutely. But in the end, the revenue flows, right? And in fact, you hear this from the agency periodically when the agency says, we have to do all these things like search and rescue, or law enforcement, that we're not paid to do, and it's sort of begrudging, and I understand why it's begrudging, because it diverts resources from supporting those people who are paying for it, right?
Hunters,
the hunters, and anglers, right? So I think that that was in the form of a question. I hope if anyone in the agency read the blog, I hope they didn't think I was accusing them of that. But it's the sense that when we have public servants, we need to be conscious about the way we fund them, because we get from the system what we put into the system. And in economics, what we like to say is incentives matter. Yeah.
I would love to test that theory broadly across the department. When I look at certain anecdotes, I think of moose biologist Lee Cantor. Lee is particularly good at saying, no, this is the science. You can't have more permits, Mr. Hunter. I mean, he basically, the IFNW has held its own against massive pushes, I think, from the sporting community about management of the moose herd, because they have been able to say to the guys who are paying the bills, nope, this is the science, this is what we're going to do. So they can do it. Do they do it every time? I don't know.
Yeah, but they can do it if the goal is to maintain a viable population of moose that'll be available for hunting in the future, right?
That is true.
And if the goal was a different one in terms of species exposure,
sure.
Right?
If the goal was to get rid of the coyotes so we have more deer, we'd have a different discussion.
Yeah.
There's all kinds of things that sporting community comes to IFNW wanting, but they don't get.
Right.
So there's evidence to the contrary, and I don't know if we can devolve an answer from this.
No, we can't, right? and we'd have to study this across multiple agencies, and we'd have to find some states where they don't fund their fish and wildlife management from consumptive use fees. And I don't know if there are actually any states that do that, but we'd have to do some of those comparisons like that.
Well, in the 10 years now that I've been in the legislature, we've always been looking for additional revenue for the department because they're underfunded, and it all comes from these fees, these license fees. And there really ought to be more contribution from the people who are also using the services.
Exactly. Yeah, and so then the question is, if the license fees were going to the general fund and they were being, just blindly going to the general fund, and then they had to fight with everybody else through appropriations, would they get more or less than they're getting now?
They would get less because, as people I know point out, the human needs trump animal needs. And we would always continue to cannibalize that department unless there was some kind of protected revenue.
Okay.
And it's protected in other states, too. And
sure,
somewhat for the same reason.
Yeah.
I mean, most 3/4 of our budget almost is education and health and human services.
Right.
That squeezes out everything else, and we've known that for 10, 15 years.
Yeah.
This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine, or as wild as it gets, sitting here in the living room of Dr. Mark Anderson, economics professor emeritus at the University of Maine. Mark recently raised some questions over an episode of this show that aired a few weeks back about the state's big game management plan. We've covered 2 of his objections so far. The third, just how wild is wildlife if we're constantly having to stick our noses in to manage it? Well, that's next on Sports Radio 92.9, The Ticket. Welcome back to Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9, The Ticket. Mark Anderson is an economics professor and a blogger for the Bangor Daily News. In a recent blog, he raised some questions about big game management in Maine after listening to my interview with the state's special projects biologist a couple of weeks ago. Since Mark is an independent observer, an economics expert, and somebody who pays attention to ethics, I pay some attention when he raises questions, even peculiar ones. To the question, does management of wildlife make it less wild? That was an interesting one to raise in your blog.
Well, now I was, that's right, I was pushing the envelope at that point. And the question came from really just thinking about the whole process of the management planning. And I had thought about the example of coyote and deer to think about regulatory capture. And I had thought about the question of bear hunting technique and the issue of means justifying being justified by the ends. And then I said, what's the example of wildlife being so managed that they didn't become wild anymore? So I was looking for some. I said, "Oh, sure, I know what this is, and I've heard this talked about a lot. And it's Atlantic salmon restoration. And for years ago, we lived in Orland, close to the fish hatchery down there, and we used to get down and put our nickel in the machine and take out the feed, and feed the display fish. And this is a great example where, because we dammed the rivers and prevented the natural...
Because we screwed up.
We did. We said, all right, what we need to do is raise salmon and dump them in the river, and they'll come back. Well, when you really think about it, to me, that just looks like aquaculture by another name, and it's just that because they're anadromous, they've got to go spend some time in the Atlantic before they come back. Not very successful aquaculture, by the way. So the question then I said is, at what point is the species not wild anymore because our management is so active? I remember years ago, Moosehorn Wildlife Refuge had a big program in terms of developing these cutover strips to encourage woodcock.
Yep.
And I was thinking, it's really great that this helps bring back woodcock numbers. But here we are, we're sort of thinking we're smart, right? And sometimes when we think we're smart, we get ourselves into trouble. And so that was more of a rhetorical question. I don't know the answer to that, but there's some threshold when we so manage the species that what we have is this big sort of theme park out there.
Well, boy, the example that comes to my mind is puffins. Oh. We would no longer have puffins in this state. We basically killed all the birds and ate all their eggs. And if it hadn't been for a heroic effort to reintroduce them, that is maintained now by basically killing any gull that causing a problem.
This is like Petite Manan.
We have 5 puffin colonies along the state. Big iconic bird. Lots of boats go out there with tourists who pay a lot of money to go see this colorful little bird out there the size of a pigeon.
And they wouldn't be here.
And they would not be here anymore.
So one of the most interesting and diverse wildlife places on the planet now is around the Chernobyl nuclear accident site, where because there's these big perimeter fences keeping people out, ironically, it has become this incredibly diverse place with no management at all, and species have shown up that they didn't expect to show up there. And I've heard that argued about some of the federal Department of Energy sites out west where there's high-level radioactive contamination in desert sites, and they have been fenced off. And sometimes getting out of the way gives us better results than managing intensively.
I sometimes snicker when I hear the balance of nature, because the nature's always in balance. We may not like the balance. We may have screwed up the balance, but there's a balance.
It is, yeah.
I mean, someday, the way this balance of nature is going, and we screw up enough, we'll have cockroaches and rats, and that'll be about it. But it'll be in balance.
It'll be in balance.
One of the ones to watch, I think, in the future is, as the eagles continue to recover, they're starting to prey on other species that are also charismatic and we like. At some point, we're going to have to shoot a few eagles to keep things in balance.
Yeah, and
we start to joke about it.
That will be a traumatic moment, won't it? Yeah. And this, without getting way off topic, this gets us in the whole realm of climate change, where people are talking now about geoengineering, which is the same logic, which is we screwed up, and somehow the fact that we screwed up and weren't very smart, we now think we're going to be smart enough to engineer the fix. Right? Yeah. And that worries me.
I would think it's so scary that jeepers out of everybody. So my principal contention, I think, in the radio show that I did a few weeks ago is that when we talk about wildlife management, it's really 90% people management.
Yeah, and I think that makes sense. And getting people to think about each other as they think about wildlife. Yeah. But that's really hard, isn't it?
Oh, it is. But really, I mean, when you look at what it is they have to do in terms of setting quotas, what the carrying capacity is, it all has to do with our own interactions.
It also has to do with our vision of what a Mainer is. Yeah. I think that's really important here, right?
It is.
And we know pretty sure those people much south of Augusta, they're not real Mainers, right?
Well, I mean, we talk about what the cultural ethics are, but we actually have a divergence of what the cultural ethic is from north to south.
We do, yeah.
You objected to IFNW's campaign on the no vote on bears because bear hunting is an issue of science, and they claim that they were the agency of science.
Yeah, so I think that's a great point. I did mention that at the end, and I think what I objected to most, and I got back to something you said earlier, that IFNW sees themselves as doing what the people ask them to do, and I do have a sense they crossed the line in the referendum where they started to say, well, we really know what this, we really know about this. It's not an ethical issue. This is a science issue, and we're the good scientists, and I do accept that they're the good scientists because I see how they're trained, and I see the work that they do. It's great work. But at some point, I thought they had become too active in suggesting that their science trumped other people's ethics. Yeah.
I was personally comfortable with it. I thought they were the experts, and that's why I'm paying them as a taxpayer.
Yeah.
So I'm going to have them tell me that.
But I think as experts, they can offer their advice without saying this is how you should vote, right? Yeah.
Yep. I fell in the no on one camp, not just because I thought IF&W science was good, but I thought the opponent's science was so bad.
Yeah.
I was really appalled by claims being made about how similar we were to Western states when we weren't.
Yeah, and I heard your shows on that, and I understood that. But again, that got me back to the question. This part of this wasn't just about the science, but in fact, what I did was I went out in one of these spruce fir thickets behind our house and tested what you explained, which is how far could you see in those woods, and I understood immediately the point you were making.
Yep. I mean, I've gone. Let's see, how many bears have I seen? I've seen one bear this year, and I've been in the woods a lot.
Yeah.
They're just hard to see.
Yeah, hard to see.
Yeah. Well, Mark, I appreciate you being on the show. I love the blog you wrote, and we ought to do this again.
Thank you, Bob. This was fun. I enjoyed it.
That's Mark Anderson, economics professor, Bangor Daily News blogger, casual observer of Maine's wildlife management plans. Next week, did you know that it is now legal to hunt with silencers? We'll dig into that. Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine is brought to you by Hammond Lumber, Doors Equipment, Napa Auto Parts, EBS, and Supercuts in Bangor, Brewer, and Old Town. This show airs every Saturday morning at 9 and Sunday morning at 8, and online afterwards at 929theticket.com. This is Sports Radio 929 The Ticket.